What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are covering some of the new rules that have just been announced regarding Legends, specifically in relation to Horus Heresy units for use in Warhammer 40,000 in its 10th edition. Buried amongst articles about stamps, Games Workshop has placed an announcement about the status of a bunch of Imperial Armor Compendium units when it comes to competitive play in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. With this announcement, they're creating a clear delineation between Warhammer 40k units proper and units meant for use in Horus Heresy, putting a lot of the Horus Heresy units that we have been living with for ages now in Warhammer 40k into a kind of Warhammer Legends status. They call this Legends of the Horus Heresy. This is largely a list of basically everything that had martial legacy from the previous edition of the game is now going on this list. This is basically receiving Warhammer Legends status. What does that mean exactly? Well, Warhammer Legends is a collection of data sheets and unit stat lines that encompass old out of production units. This allows you to continue to play those units in casual or match play games if you and your opponent agree on it. So generally speaking, these are basically for use at your local game store, for your kitchen table games, when you're hanging out and playing narrative games. But for competitive play and playing a new opponent sight unseen, these are not going to be allowed for use. So especially competitions, these will not be allowed to be included in your army. If you're playing someone new, you just basically have to ask for permission, essentially. Now, I think the reason that this doesn't go to Warhammer Legends proper is that these vehicles and units are still being produced, and the reason that they are being produced is for the Horus Heresy game. But because these are available for Horus Heresy, they aren't going out of production, and they're still going to be available for that game. So it sounds like Horus Heresy is kind of getting a larger list of supported SKUs. However, those profiles will no longer be updated for Warhammer 40,000. So what they're going to do is they're going to get a list of profiles when the edition comes out, and they're going to sit in a document for the entirety of the edition, and they're basically never going to be touched because they're not going to be balanced actively like the rest of the game. Now, honestly, this is a little bit of a bittersweet moment. There's a lot of units on here that are either very cool or that are very iconic to metagames of Warhammer 40,000 past. That said, balancing the Imperial Armor Compendium for Warhammer 40,000 has always been kind of a nightmare, and especially so for the Space Marine unit list, because they have already had more units than most other armies put together, but then also the inclusion of Horus Heresy units and Forge World Space Marine units just bloated that total number of data sheets to absolutely insane levels. So oftentimes we saw random Horus Heresy data sheets and weapons and vehicles from the Horus Heresy that would slot into Warhammer 40,000 lists because they basically survived the balance pass. They were overlooked, their points value wasn't corrected, and they created some problems. Relic Contemptor Dreadnoughts, I think, are the perfect example of that. Those guys stuck around for a really long time throughout 8th edition and 9th edition because their profile was just better than anything else. And we see them even up through the Arcs of Omen season in the Iron Hands list, where you can dump a bunch of upgrades on a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought with a high volume of attacks and send its damage output through the roof. It's probably one of the most high damage potential units in the entire game. We saw the same thing with Landspeeder Tempest back at the beginning of the edition, and Landspeeder Javelins even, and it's just kind of been an open question, whether or not these units should be retained within Warhammer 40,000. Now, the entire list of units that are being added to Legends of the Horus Heresy is pretty long. Leviathan and Derrideo Dreadnoughts, as is to be expected, but the surprise here is the Contemptor Dreadnought as well. This one is fairly shocking because the Contemptor does have a plastic kit and has been available as a plastic kit for a really long time. Now, whether or not that means that Relic Contemptor Dreadnoughts for other factions that are not Space Marines, whether those will still be available, I don't know. I bet that they are, especially for Adeptus Custodes, but it sounds like they may be unavailable for Space Marines. The Kratos, Sicarian, Spartan, Cerberus, and Typhon tanks. A little bit of a sad time for the Sicaran there. That one is one of my favorites. I'll do like a fast, good-looking tank. Certain variants of the Land Raider, Vindicator, and Whirlwind. I think we can specifically talk about the Whirlwind Scorpius for sure, and the Phobos Land Raider, although whether or not we see some of the more modern varieties of Forge World Land Raiders, like the Achilles, I'm not 100% sure. Xiphon Interceptors, Fire Raptors, Storm Eagles, and Storm Birds, all going the way of the dodo, unfortunately. Legion support weapons, so unfortunately I think the Rapier Carrier is going to be dropping off as well. Fellblades, Falchions, Mastodons, Javelins, and the drop pod variants, including Deathstorm and Dreadnought drop pods, as well as some units for other factions, not just Space Marines. Secutarii Hoplites, Terrax Pattern Termite Drills. That one's actually a big one because that vehicle is available in 9th edition to basically every army in the game. Decimators, Greater Blight Drones, Blood Slaughterers, Greater Brass Scorpions, Khitan Ravagers, the Charybdis Assault Claw, and the Dread Claw drop pod. That one's another big one because that gives a drop pod effect to Chaos Space Marine armies. So without that, they're not going to have an analog to the regular Space Marine drop pod. Now, importantly, not all Forge World or Horus Heresy units are actually being added to the Legends of the Horus Heresy document. Instead, Adeptus Custodes and Imperial Knight units are all going to be available both for play in Warhammer 40,000, competitive play, and for play in Horus Heresy. So this is things like the Aquilon Terminators, or those big kind of penis-shaped bikes that everyone just uses for their bike captain, as well as all the Imperial Knight variants that we know and love. So Knight Moiraxes, that new Cerastus Knight Lancer, and Megaeras are all gonna, Megaeras and Porphyrons, those are all gonna be available still, is what this article is indicating. Now, this is an enormous announcement. It kind of changes pretty dramatically the face of competitive play in Warhammer 40,000, and there are some caveats, to be fair. First off, obviously, it is only for competitive play. So if you aren't planning to play competitively, if you only play narrative games or, you know, just fun times games with your friends, then you're good to go. But also, as a 40k player, we love proxying. And one way that I see a lot of Horus Heresy models get added into 40k armies is just as stand-ins for existing 40k models. I played against probably most of the Primarch models at some point, representing some variety of Dreadnought or Big Monster, or just a stand-in for Robute Gilliman. And now we have the Lionel Johnson profile to do that as well. Things like the Contemptor Dreadnought can stand in for Box Dreadnoughts. The same goes for Leviathans and Daradeos. Those can easily slot in for any of the existing vehicles. Vehicle variants are also really easy to slot in as long as they're around the same dimensions as an existing vehicle. You can basically use them as a transposition, and especially things like Land Raiders. I don't think anyone would have a problem you using a Land Raider of a slightly different variant to represent a standard Land Raider in a normal game of 40k. So I don't think I would throw away your Horus Heresy resin models quite immediately. You can definitely find ways to use them in your 40k armies in a way that's creative and interesting. But what this does do is shave down the total number of profiles in the game that will be considered for competitive play, which means that I think it's going to be much easier to maintain the balance of the game. And we have less of these opportunities where random compositions of models accidentally break the metagame. As sad as I'm sure this announcement is going to be for a lot of people, I do think that's overall going to be helpful to the health of the game. And it further differentiates Horus Heresy from Warhammer 40,000. Horus Heresy is less of a old school version of 40k that has less units in it, and now has a more distinct roster of units that are regularly viable, which I think differentiates the games a little bit more, especially since discourse around 40k and Horus Heresy are basically oftentimes just amalgamated together. Having more differentiation between the games, I think, is always going to be good. But anyway, let me know down in the comment section what you think about this change. And big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, you can join in the link down below the video. And Twitch subscribers, I love you all. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and happy wargaming.